You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, I'm Osman Butt, video producer of Middle East Monitor. Syria has experienced a horrific and brutal war over the last decade, with hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced. The Mediterranean country is often described as a mosaic of different sects, religions, cultures, and ethnicities. One group, the Circassians, estimated at 100,000 before 2011, sought refuge in Syria in the 19th century. Small but integral to Syria, as many other minorities are, we are asking how the last decade has impacted them. We're also going to be discussing activism and, of course, most importantly, the prospects of accountability in this war. Joining us to discuss this is Celine Kasem. Celine Kasem is a media executive at the Syrian Emergency Task Force, whose aim is to relentlessly force for change. She believes that her diverse background embodiment allows her to reach further audiences, embodying unique blends of Syrian, Circassian, and Canadian background. Celine has been deeply ingrained in the humanitarian crisis enveloping in her homeland. Witnessing the pain and hardship faced by her people, she joined the noble revolution in Syria, which began as a peaceful protest adorned with roses. That's quite an interesting description there. A true citizen of the world, Celine has lived in various corners of the globe, including in the US and Canada. This international experience has only intensified her resolve, sharpening her advocacy for the voiceless. While most youngsters were navigating their way through high school, Celine was already a fervent activist, channeling the collective pain of Syrians through her outspoken voice and humanitarian deeds. With the unquenchable thirst for knowledge in the field, she got a bachelor's in political science to further bolster her advocacy and policy work. Currently at SETF, Syrian Emergency Task Force, she has been involved deeply in political advocacy, accountability, and humanitarian work, covering most aspects of the Syrian crisis. Celine is now advocating her academic journey with a master's in intercultural communications. Her goal is to deepen her expertise and continue applying for the voice of those who have been silenced by circumstance. For Celine Kasem, activism is not a choice, it is a calling. Her passion is not just evident in what she does, but also in the relentless way she goes about doing it. She is an activist, she is a lifeline, a voice, and a beacon of hope for the Syrian people. Celine, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Hello, thank you guys so much for having me on.
And thank you for coming to us and talking to us today. So we're going to obviously start right at the beginning. And I want to sort of talk a little bit about you personally. I mean, obviously you grew up in a number of different places, but you're obviously very connected to Syria. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about, the different places you've been in and, how you grew up?
Yeah, so background-wise, I would say that I'm Syrian Circassian. I'm also part Armenian as well. And I was born in Saudi because my parents got married and left Syria because of the economic situations even back then in the day. So I was born in Saudi, and then we would go and visit Syria every summer. And then, when everything started, I moved to the States. We tried to get asylum in the States. That didn't work out. So then went to Canada. So I would say I lived my life, half kind of in the East, so that would be Saudi, and then in the West, and that would be the States and Canada. And so I grew up with kind of both the cultures in me, you know, kind of like the Arab as well as the Circassian as well as the Western, all different ideologies, all different cultures, kind of in a cocktail into who I became to be. And along with all of that, I did try to. I mean, I was 11 when the Syrian Revolution started. I was a child. And I was extremely involved. You know, my father, him and his, you know, all Syrians all around the world made this like their side job when it started, and they would do everything that they can to help their people if they were abroad. So my father was one of the people, you know, that started on these humanitarian missions, him with a bunch of his friends. You know, they would fill up trucks and bring them down to Jordan for refugees, and they would, you know, collect all these funds for people, for refugees, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously with watching the news, and I was just always there, and I was always watching and seeing what was happening. And none of it made sense because, you know, I was 11 years old, but since then I was very involved. And then when we went to the States and then Canada, when there would be the protests that would happen, when there's huge massacres, I would always go with my family and be there and do it in a way that the West would understand it. Because sometimes, you know, when we go and we scream in Arabic in these protests, you know, they're not going to understand what we're saying. And you have to do it in a way that it would come across as something that they would understand, because that's what we want. We want people to understand what's happening, to be able to come to collectively help our people and find a political solution in Syria.
It's interesting as well because, of course, you were very young when the Syrian Revolution broke out in 2011. And so I'm sort of wondering then, you know, what kind of memories and connections specifically to Syria did you have before the revolution? You know, what do you remember of the place?
Yeah. Well, as I said, yeah, we would go every summer, and I remember very much the village of my grandparents' house. It's in Marj Sultan. It's in the suburbs of Damascus. And, you know, all the fruit that was in my grandpa's, you know, garden, the grapes, the olives that we would have every morning. And just, it was simple. You know, we would go, I mean, we were kids. We didn't know the reality, but it was always nice to go back and to visit in the summer and see all of our family, because in Saudi we didn't have any family. So when we would go, it would just be very nice to see everyone all together and kind of reunite. And I mean, I have beautiful memories of Syria, and just being together, and then kind of connecting more to my Circassian culture when we go to Syria, because in Syria their village was all Circassians. And we would go to like the Circassian weddings, and those are very famous because of their dances and all of that. The Circassian Community Center, we didn't have those in Saudi. So that was always nice to go back and connect to that. Because as a child, you don't really understand, you know, what is this and why am I this along with this? But then when you grow up and you realize, you look back and it's like, oh, this was that and that was this. But I have beautiful memories of Syria, and I can't wait for the day that I can go back. But simply that's impossible now.
And so I'm sort of wondering, I mean, you know, obviously you had a certain experience of, you know, Syria before the revolution. I also suspect as well, because you go to Syria every summer, as you say, and to connect with your culture and family, you get to see things. Possibly also the weather is a bit easier to deal with than in Saudi during the summer. I imagine that plays a big role. But I also, you know, wonder, you know, because of course we have certain memories from a time period, and then things happen, and then our memories and our understanding of what, you know, those things meant have changed. And I'm sort of wondering, over the years, how has your understanding of how you were brought up and your relationship to Syria changed because of what's happened there?
Yeah, because because you don't really understand these things, as I said, as a child. But then when you grow up and you're like, oh, that was like a military airport that was right next to where, you know, my grandpa's house was. And that's why there was these, you know, trucks and big, what are they called? The big military cars that would come in. And then, as you know, you would see the photos of Bashar al-Assad or Hafiz Assad all over the streets as a child, but like never really came to me, and I wouldn't see that anywhere else around the world. But now it's like, yes, that was there even when I was a kid and I would go and visit. That was there. You just never really click with it, and never notice it as a child. And now, I mean, I have a baby sister whose name is Sham, on Damascus, because we don't get to go to Damascus now, so we named her Sham. And we were in Turkey, and then she saw like a photo of Ataturk. She's like, "Who is this?" And I'm like, "Oh wow! Like if only you knew what it's like in Syria." So yeah, it's like these things that happen and take place, and as a child you don't realize, but then I grew up and I was like, wow, like yeah, that was there, and you know, I did see these things, but you don't recognize them until later, and you see the full picture.
Yeah, it's interesting because by saying, you know, obviously you've got a baby sister who's, you know, named Sham, it does sort of show a very strong attachment to the country that you obviously do have, and that, you know, and I'm sort of, you know, wondering though, because of course, before we get on to Circassians, or there's actually, before we go there, Circassian or Circassian, what's the actual
Circassian. You can actually say it both ways. It doesn't matter.
That's why it was so confusing, because some people pronounce it Circassian and others Circassian. I think one might just be a bit more of an English influence, and the other is just perhaps closer to how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I sort of wonder as well, because of course, as you mentioned, you were always very interested in this, and you got very involved early on with activism because of through your parents when you were living in Canada. But I sort of also wonder, you know, when you did move to the West, what was it about, you know, living in the West that you found different, challenging, good, bad, you know, compared to home, and how did this sort of change your understanding of identity?
Well, first off, I don't really think that I've ever had like a back home, because Syria was never back home because I never lived there. Saudi was never back home because it wasn't my culture. And then the only thing that's kind of felt the closest to home is Canada, because, you know, it gave me that safe space, that citizenship. You know, it gave me so many opportunities. So Canada's the closest thing that I've had to home. But then, yeah, moving because I moved from Saudi to the States, it was a big difference. Because I mean, people as kids, I mean, I was like in grade 7 or 8. Yeah, I faced a little bit of, you know, like some Islamophobia, some of those kinds of basic things that as an Arab Muslim that moves to the West kind of goes through. So that was not fun. And at the time, you know, people would say these things, but I never really knew how to combat it because I was just a kid, and and this was like the peak of ISIS. So everything that, you know, had to do with the Middle East was, you know, ISIS. And there was this new girl, you know, me and my sister, these two girls that just moved from Saudi. And then these people know nothing about the Middle East, like especially as, you know, younger kids. And I lived in a town in New Jersey that was very, very white. Like it was very not diverse at all. So it was just very new to them, and they had no idea. And they thought that like Saudi was like Dubai, and like people had like camels and sheep. And I was like, no, babe, like we have way more like urban civilization than your little town will ever have. But yeah, so me and my sister faced a little bit of that, and then it was just a little bit of time until like we like opened and started making friends, and it was completely fine after that. But there was always that, and there was always the fact that you had to, you know, make people understand who you are and what you are and what's happening in your country and why did you live in a country that was not your. So there's a whole like history lesson that you have to give to people that you want to become friends with, or to the teachers, or to this and that. So did experience a lot of that. Canada is nothing like the States when it comes to that. Canada is very, very, very diverse. If you'd ever want to be racist, you don't know who the hell to be racist towards. So yeah, and Canada has felt like home. And yeah, basically.
That's interesting. I mean, I was thinking, one strategy you could have adopted just to see how people reacted is to have like in front of your house a sign, the original Caucasians.
Literally, like, because it was this huge, like, old historian that changed and made it Europeans. Like, we're the original Caucasians, but okay.
Yes, and it's now, I think, a good time to get into the history. I mean, so obviously, as I sort of mentioned in an introduction, Circassians, I'm getting there.
Got it.
They initially, come from what is today the sort of northern Caucasus region. So before the 19th century, you have a series of emirates in sort of the Caucasus area. Which includes places, to the south. You've got Chechnya, Dagestan, you've got Ingushetia, and then in the north you have, various others, including, Circassians who tended to come from the north, with its capital of Sochi, which was one of the key capitals. But then as we sort of saw the Russian Empire expand into, I mean, I think actually it was also technically under the Emirate of the Tartars in Crimea. Is that correct? I can't remember the exact history between Crimea and the Caucasus, but there's a connection there too. But anyway, but what happens in the 19th century, especially as we see Russia expanding into these areas, and the Circassians who come from the northern part of the Caucasus are largely killed or expelled. And many of them end up in the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Large chunk end up in present-day Turkey, and many get resettled across the Middle East, including in Syria. Is that a fair summation of how they ended up in Syria?
Yeah, so a little bit of reiteration on that. People don't know that Circassians and this whole group of, land that was trying to be overtaken by Russia, they fought the Russians for 100 years. So the war had started in 1764 and continued on to 1864. And they were fighting for all that long. And then when, they had lost so much of their people, so much of their land, there was some sort of, and then by the way, there's records in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, I think, Tbilisi, however you say it. There are Russian records of the names of all the Circassians, all the Adiga people, and there's over 1.5 million people that were killed during the 100 years, along with when they put them on boats to send them off to the Ottoman Empire regions. They put them on boats, and when they put them on those boats, they bombed those boats, and then people died again in the ocean. And there's this thing that if you're Circassian and still in the Caucasus, in there now, you don't eat from the Black Sea because that has the blood of your ancestors in it. Over 1.5 people that were killed by Russia back then. And as you said, so they came to those regions. They came to mostly Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine even, and they kind of resettled into those areas. And they kind of went in like pockets. So I can speak on Syria. They went to the suburbs of Homs, the suburbs of Aleppo, and Golan Heights. So my great grandparents had settled in Golan Heights. And as I said, so they kind of came in pockets because you kind of hang out with your community, kind of if you're displaced. So there was 3 different regions that they settled in, and it was those in Syria. And in Syria, they were welcome just like any other ethnic minority, ethnic background that had, found refuge in those regions. They were just like any other citizen. They came in, they became a part of Syrian society, and they built their homes, they got their jobs, and they were just like anyone else in Syria. And so as I said, my great grandparents had came to Golan Heights. And then in the Arab-Israeli war, they had to flee once again. So so their land was taken, and then my grandpa himself, he was, I think, around in his late 20s. They had to leave. They had to leave their house, all of their stuff, everything they'd ever known in Golan Heights, and were internally displaced again to Damascus this time around. So they came to Damascus and settled there, and had to start from zero, actually, once again. So I always say that, like, my bloodline has immigrated so many times. There was the Circassian, and then there was the Golan Heights, and then there was the revolution, displacement. So, I mean, my grandpa alone 3 times. Get up, pack up, and go. Get up, pack up, and go. Get up, pack up, and go. And you know, my grandpa's passed away recently, but like, he would always tell us the craziest stories about how, you know, in Netra, which is a little village in Golan Heights, how, you know, Turkmens lived there, Druze lived there, Circassians lived there, Armenians, Christians, in all one village. And I don't know of a country that is as small as Syria that, you know, housed and was a haven for all these different ethnic minorities, you know, religious sects, backgrounds, you know, in one small area. So I think that's super interesting, and beautiful until the regime took that and took advantage of it. But yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask you before I go further into history, what is the sort of connection between Circassians and people like Chechens?
So it's the same region, and then so Ediga is like the big branch, and then under it would come, you know, the Dagestanis, the Chechens, the Circassians. So we're all kind of the same thing, but different pockets of regions, and they were all targeted the same way. But maybe it was a little bit later or a little bit before, timing wise. But we all kind of go back to the Ediga, which is, you know, the Circassians, ethnic bloodline, I guess you could say, the Caucasian people.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting because culturally and historically, Circassians have a certain, you know, reputation over time. I mean, within the Ottoman Empire and in Turkey, it was considered to be even in Europe, actually, at one point, to be a Circassian bride was considered something spectacular up until the 19th century. You would see this being used a lot to signify beauty and attraction. It's really interesting to me that a community this small and so far away suddenly became the idea, even as far as Britain and the US. You know, it's a very odd kind of thing when you think about it. That's also part of the history.
Yeah. And I mean, there's other things. I mean, they fought the Russians for 100 years. They are, you know, they are strong, and they are fighters. You know, they were out and they were battling the Russian Empire for all those years. And we're known for our dancing and our culture, and our beauty, as you said. But I think that it's also important to recognize, you know, how brave these people were, and how much they lost back in the day when they were fighting for 100 years and lost 1.5 million of their people, trying to fight back for their land. But they unfortunately lost, because, you know, they were fighting the Russians. And yeah.
So when you say 1.5 million, do you mean 1.5 million were killed or were expelled?
They were that 1.5 million. There's records of 1.5 million people that were killed in the 100-year war. And then when they were expelled, I think that's also the number of the people that were killed when they were leaving on the boats. So, and those are Russian records that you can find in Georgia's capital.
Okay, interesting. Because also when they sort of arrived, I mean, it was interesting. So I once read, how did the Ottomans sort of receive all these refugees? It wasn't just Circassians. Circassians. It was many other groups that were coming across into the Ottoman Empire from lands that Russia was expanding into. And they had to set, I think they were the first country to set up a refugee agency ministry just to handle all of it. And depending on the period you migrated to, they had different considerations. And so for the Circassians, one of the considerations for one of the first waves was, we need to find somewhere which is very similar to where they came from. And that's why many were settled in the Golan, because they thought mountainous people, mountainous area, easier for integration. But within, obviously, jumping forward a little bit, in different countries, Circassians have, different kinds of reputations. In Turkish Republic, where I think it's where the largest number are, if I'm correct. They have this sort of double reputation where they're sort of, the early Turkish Republic tended to view them with greater suspicion. There was always a sense that Circassians are not loyal to the Turkish Republic. There's actually a really good book written about it. But in Syria, they seem to have had a very different reputation. Could you talk us through, what life in Syria was like?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, they were welcomed into the society, and they were just like any other background. So there was the Kurds, there was the Turkmen, there was the Christians, the various different people that were coming into Syria, and they were welcomed, and they were known as loyal because of how long they fought for their land. They were known as brave and courageous as they were. And it's kind of the same thing in Jordan. So up until this day, the National Guard of the king, I think they're all Circassian, which is interesting. And in Syria, it was kind of the same thing. So they went in, there wasn't like a specific set job kind of that they went into. They were just regular, Syrian civilians that were at this point just regular people that were integrated into society. They had their own, they had their own culture, their own communities, a lot, but at the same time, they were also integrated into the Syrian community and the Syrian culture. And it's super cute. I mean, as I said, growing up, we would go at Jamia Circassiya in Itsaya, which if you're a Circassian listening to this, you would know what I'm talking about. But yeah, there's like these huge community centers that we had in the pockets of where, Circassians were. And, you show up there, there's like, dance classes and, there's language classes. I mean, I never learned Circassian, but I mean, my parents speak it, my grandparents speak it. My grandpa's Arabic was kind of not good because he was always like his native language was Circassian. So then he would call us in Arabic and like the male pronoun. I'm like, Jidda, that's not right. But yeah, so they had their own communities, but also at the same time, they were integrated just like any other sect, any other minority ethnic background in Syria. And they became regular people. And then, but the being internally displaced once again was not easy. And I've heard of various different stories from my grandpa or from, other of my friends' grandparents who actually lived that displacement from Golan Heights to Damascus or wherever they ended up going. And that was not easy. I mean, once again, they had left everything behind. And they had to start from zero. So that was not easy at all. And then that kind of plays into how your life ends up happening. And by the way, when the Golan Heights displacement happened, a bunch of Circassians went to the US since then. So they went to New Jersey. I think there was some sort of agreement with some sort of something. And they ended up going to New Jersey. So I have my grandma's siblings, they all went to New Jersey since then. And I always forget the date. But yeah, when that displacement happened, they went there. But I mean, my grandparents, they stayed in Syria. And then, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you do get the impression that the culture continues in many of these places. I mean, I remember when I was living in Syria, I went to this bookstore and I was trying to actually buy something else. I was trying to get hold of a 19th century edition of a French to Ottoman dictionary, just because I thought it'd be cool. But the guy wouldn't sell it to me because I think he thought I was an Arab and had no money. And
Oh,
in the end, he sold me something else, which was a dictionary, which was Arabic, English, and Circassian.
wow.
And it was written by someone local who wanted to teach people how to read and understand Circassian. So you saw a lot of things like that around that time. I sort of now, obviously, we've gotten to 2011. And obviously, the revolution happens in 2011. It goes, that revolution in many ways is still continuing, as we sort of see in places like Suwayda more recently. But obviously, you've also had a war, and probably even, quite significantly, and I'd imagine very significantly for Circassians, Russian intervention. So what has been, the situation for Circassians in Syria since the revolution, and how they've been impacted by it?
Okay, well, this is one thing that I would like to clear up is they were just like any other Syrian, treated the exact same way. So they kind of just like any other Syrian that you can find in any other family. People chose sides, you could say, and there were people that recognized that what the regime has been doing for 50 years is not right and it's dictatorship. So they went out and they peacefully protested in the streets. And then there was people who didn't and who joined the army and were a part of the crime, you could say. So just like any other group of people, some of us supported the revolution, some of us were writers to the regime and to the army. So and he detained anyone that peacefully went out and protested, and he tortured, hundreds of Circassians that went out and peacefully protested. So in this context, I would just like to reiterate that they were Syrians in this point of age, in this point of time. They were just Syrians, and just like any other Syrian family, you were either on this side or that side, and then you face those consequences. So I personally have cousins that were protesting and that got detained, and then 2 of them had passed away from under torture, and they're Circassian. So, and then you see like other people that joined the army and then that were taking part of that whole narrative that the regime came up with, which we can discuss later. But yeah, they were just like any other people, any other sect, any other minority, any other community in Syria that were impacted and then were displaced, and fled to all around the globe. I mean, came to Turkey, came to Jordan, came to Lebanon, they rowed in boats once again and went to Europe, and they're all over, just like any other Syrians that were. I mean, the regime killed 1 million Syrians, displaced half of the population. The literal half of the population of Syria is just outside of Syria now. It's either internally displaced, so in different regions of Syria, or outside of the country, and destroyed 60% of the country. So, I mean, just like any other group of people. Yeah.
It's interesting because obviously, as you were alluding to, the thing you wanted to get into is the claim that the regime Bashar al-Assad makes, which is that he is the protector of minorities. And this is obviously quoted in the idea that, because this is obviously part of a narrative, right? So in 2011, when he first, the crisis is brewing in Daraa, he goes to his parliament and he doesn't really acknowledge the protests themselves. He has this classical trick, which he repeated at the Arab League summit earlier this year, where he sort of doesn't acknowledge there's any issue. But in the 2011 speech, he spoke about foreign infiltrators and people trying to harm the social fabric of Syrian society. And that was basically all he had to say on the protests. But then as time sort of went on, the narrative that got framed was, these protesters are, basically Al-Qaeda. This is his sort of rhetoric because they come from Sunni areas. And he is the protector of minorities, primarily of which he means particularly Christians and Alawis. Alawis, because obviously that's the sect he comes from. Christians, because that's the influence to the West. They're trying to influence Western countries not to intervene or do anything, even though he didn't really protect them either. I mean,
and they believed it. They believed it. The West believed this rhetoric, this disgusting rhetoric that a dictator came up with. And this is important because these Western diplomats, you know, the British diplomats and the American diplomats and all these people, they were there in 2011 and they saw the peaceful protests. They saw people who went out in March 2011 because their kids got detained and tortured and killed. I would be angered and I would want to go out and protest if that happened to my kids. They saw people that went out in the streets holding flowers, asking for the removal of this dictator regime, asking for freedom and asking for dignity, which is a human right. So as Syrians, they believed, you know, and they were inspired by the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was happening and people were out there, you know, in Tunis and they thought that, wow, this is so inspirational. We're going to do the same thing and we're going to go out. And they were terrified. Their parents told them, you know, these people that went out, their parents told them, hey, by the way, we saw what the regime is capable of back in the 70s, back in the 80s. They killed everyone that came and spoke a single word. And there's a saying in Syria that says the walls listen to you. You're not allowed to speak, even in your home, to criticize the government. It's a dictatorship and it's tyrants in this regime that use this narrative, which is a big lie, that it's a secular government. As I said, there's Sunnis, there's Shias, there's Jewish, there's Christians, there's Druze, Turkmen, Circassian, all of these different ethnic minorities, all of these different backgrounds and sects all coexisted in Syria for hundreds of years and peacefully coexisted and were neighbors. So when this regime came in place 50 years ago, and this was Hafiz al-Assad, when he wanted to do the Qawmiyya al-Arabiyyah, which is, I guess, like the you would translate that to the Arabic,
Arabic
like
nationalism.
Arabic nationalism. Yes, that's it. You know, he came up with that, and then he was like, look, this guy doesn't have your best interest at heart because he's different than you. He's Sunni, or he's this and that, and then people, you know, they had never thought about that before until this came into play, until the Ba'ath Party came with its nationalist ideals and pushed this against on the people. And then 2011, I mean, there is records of Bashar al-Assad literally releasing prisoners that ended up joining these terrorist groups, and you know, so this was all a big part of their genius plan that a lot of different nations believed, and we're like, okay, well, we're not going to intervene, because if we do intervene, the crazy, you know, he has the secular people at heart and their best interest, and they want the best for all the different minorities. That's not true, because these people coexisted for hundreds of years peacefully, and the regime is who created this hate and you know, different levels. I mean, if you're not a minority in the army, you're only Alawi. If you work with the regime, if you work in good jobs in the government, you're only Alawi. He created these groups, and they were in charge of the country. So I don't like to speak in secularism, and I don't like to speak in that, because we're not like that. But the regime created this on us, and as we're seeing today, and as so many other examples show you and tell you that that's simply not true. Today in Suwayda, all these Druze that are a minority are after 13 years reigniting the revolution and calling out for freedom, calling out for dignity, calling out for the removal of this dictator regime and calling out for UN Resolution 2254, because we are tired, and they have nothing left to lose. They saw what the regime is capable of. They saw that the regime can kill, can bomb, can chemically attack civilians, but they're still going out and they're still doing this. However, the regime has not cracked down on them yet, because he's trying to keep up with this narrative, and he's trying to say that, hey, look, I mean, I protect minorities, and look, I'm letting them go out and protest. But at any moment, they're besieged now. Nothing is coming in and out, but it's scary. And at any moment, he can do that, and he can kill them, and he can do the same thing that he did back in 2011, once again, on these innocent people that are protesting peacefully, before any of that, any of the various different, interventions that happened in our country took place, and then the opposition, and then all these other things that took us to a place that we were not what we wanted back in the beginning of the what I like to call the Noble Revolution.
Yes, it's a very interesting area to get into, because of course what we see from the regime over the years and since 2011 is a kind of prolonged strategy where, for example, as you sort of rightly point out, much of the divisions we see in Syrian society actually emanate from the regime itself. So when, for example, the protests started happening, obviously you had a violent crackdown. But what you noticed is, depending on the area, dictated the kind of response you would have got from the authorities. So there's two dimensions to that. There's partly class, because the fact is a lot of the areas where you saw big protests and extreme violence used tended to either be poorer or from parts of the community where there's more of a private economy. So that's partly how we saw the division in Aleppo happen. But I think a big part also was sect. So if they, when you had protests, you saw areas where there were a lot of Sunnis, there would be a lot of shooting by security forces, Assad's forces, a lot more violence used. When minority areas would protest, you'd see slightly less. And this was all part of an actual strategy to try and effectively sectarianize the country, because from Assad's point of view, it's not enough to just simply say, I'm the protector of minorities, and use that as his propaganda. He needs to foster a response and a suspicion among many Sunnis as well that the minorities are not there with you. And you do that by using this sort of strategy of like hybrid of, I'll use more violence against you, or why aren't we using more violence against them, to try and foster that kind of division.
But he did kill all different minorities. There's Christians, Alawis, Circassians, Druze, Turkmen. He killed everyone. If you were detained, they didn't not detain you because you were this or that. But you are true, the different crackdown methods that took place in the specific regions depended on, what is this majority of this community? What is going to be the reaction from the, people watching? What's going to, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, as I said, we did this, and then we had the best interests of the international community. We had thought that they would listen. And all these countries that claim to be democratic and claim to care for human rights and have the UN and have the EU and all of the, we thought that after all of this pain, misery, and going out and asking for this, that someone would stand by our side. We were betrayed by the international community when the Assad regime used chemical bombs on civilians, and there is proof of this over 200 times. The OCW, there is proof of the regime using chemical weapons over 200 times on their people, and no one acted. The Syrian people felt alone, felt betrayed, and continue to this day. Every 6 months, we have to beg the UN to allow humanitarian cross-border assistance into northwest Syria. 4 million besieged people in a small geographic region, and every 6 months we have to ask for the world to allow this humanitarian assistance, and then Russia vetoes it every 6 months. And then the Assad regime goes, yeah, I'll allow it, and then I won't allow it. How are you giving the authority to the same people that have killed these people, displaced these people, detained and tortured their children, the authority over whether they get to live or not? I visit northwest Syria. I go and I see it's insane how much these people have lived. There is nothing that they haven't experienced at this point. The earthquake was the last thing that they didn't experience. And when the earthquake happened, you know what they told me? They were saying that this is the easiest thing that we've lived through over the past 12 years. This is nothing compared to the Ghouta chemical attacks. This is nothing compared to us being besieged for years on end in Aleppo. So it's important for us to reiterate this again and again and again, is that these people had thought that the world was going to listen to their cries. The world was going to see that, look, oh my God, this dictator tyrant regime is killing its people. And then it got assistance from Hezbollah, and then it got assistance from Iran, and then it got assistance from Russia. Russia was using Syria as a playground field to test its weapons on Syrian civilians. And this whole time, their narrative is that everyone that they're killing, everyone that they're bombing, everyone that they're besieging are terrorists. And that is simply not true.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, I was going to come back to the Circassians in this regard, because the fact is, you know, many are now displaced again, obviously like the rest of Syrians, because there's no distinction, as you say, correctly point out. But for Circassians specifically, Circassians, it's the fact that Russia is involved again as well. So it's, you've gone to Syria to seek refuge and Russia has come to you. Could you talk to us a bit about that dynamic? Your sound's gone off for some reason. We seem to be experiencing a slight technical difficulty. Oh, I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Yeah. I mean, it was a big wow, like it's once again, here we are again after Jordan, after Kafkas, after you know, as I said, being displaced over and over and over again as Circassians, as our bloodline. It was crazy. I mean, Russian intervention in Syria, as I said, they used it as a playground. They used it as, we're gonna try all these weapons that, by the way, if we had stopped them back in the day, if anyone had stopped them back in the day, we wouldn't be where we are today with Ukraine. We wouldn't be facing this once again. And then you see the international stage reaction to Syria. I mean, they're supporting Ukrainian soldiers right now, and they're funding, they're giving them weapons, they're giving them aircraft, they're giving them all of this support. And if we had gotten anything close to that back in the day, we would have defeated the regime a long time ago. And it's crazy when you compare the two, and you see the different reactions. But yeah, as Circassians, they were, I mean, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna, it's again and again, and it's I mean, the Russian regime is a murderous tyrant regime, and we need to put a stop to this. Over history, they've done this over and over and over again. And I think that it's time for the international world to say, hey, listen, this is it. And stop their killing machine and their playbook.
Yes, and it's interesting because in a way, you know, the playbook is something that Circassians experienced, you know, 200 years ago. Obviously, it's been updated slightly and adapted to Syria, but it's the same playbook fundamentally. You know, I think a lot of people, especially in the West, they've started to realize, although perhaps in the left and parts of the right, they don't fully grasp Russia as an empire behaving like one. Yeah. I mean, as I said, they're doing it. I mean, maybe it took for them to do that in Ukraine for the world to see. But as Syrians, we're always gonna, you know, connect the two and be like, hey, look, you care about what's happening in Ukraine. I think, my guy, like this happened 4 years ago in Syria, you know, and not even 4 years ago. When I tell you that Idlib gets bombed every single day by Russian forces and by Assad forces, it happens every single day. The organization
SETF, the organization that I work at, we have an app called Syria Watch. You can download this app on your phone. It gives you coordinates of the attacks every single day that happen on the heads of civilians by Russian Air Force and by the Assad regime. This has not stopped. What's happening in Syria, the war crimes of the Russian regime and by the Assad regime have not stopped in Syria. And it's crazy because, even when Putin was going through his own thing and Wagner was trying to do a coup on him, they were bombing Syria as that was happening. We're like, oh my God, they're going to get busy for a minute. Maybe these people can live for 2 days. No, they were continuing to bomb Syria as that was happening. And it happens every single day. And no one knows about this, which is why we continue to do what we do. And I continue to bring attention to this every single day of my life.
It's kind of an interesting point to reflect upon, in a sense, because there's a kind of weird perverseness about this, because obviously you'll remember on the day of the attempted coup by Wagner in Russia, they couldn't get anyone in Russia, in the Russian military, to stop the Wagner advance. There was no Russian military men available. They were calling in drunk or not turning up at all. They could barely stop the advance. In the end, Wagner stopped its own advance. Yet they could still bomb Syria. There's some sort of you would think it should be the other way around, effectively. You would think they would stop the foreign operation in order to focus on the homeland, but the homeland, they couldn't organize it there, which I think reveals the weakness of Russia generally. But moving on, what do you think of as the future of Syria and the regime?
I would like to think that the Assad regime is a part of the past now. And yes, they're continuing their war crimes and continuing killing our people. But after all of this, and by the way, I think that the world knows. The world is not, it's not blind. They know what happened in Syria. They know. But for their interests and for their agendas, they didn't fully put a stop to it. And because some of them did believe of the narrative that the regime put on. And the regime had the help of the second biggest army in the world, so it makes sense that, they won with their narrative. They didn't win at all in the whole, crisis, because since the first day of the first protests in Syria, I would like to think that that's when the regime fell, because the people had the bravery and the means to go out and to ask and to call for the removal of this regime. And since then, the regime has been trying its absolute hardest to shut this down and to kill everyone and to silence everyone that said anything against the regime by all of the means. And then when he couldn't do it alone, they got all the intervention that they needed. They got the Iranian militias, they got Hezbollah, they got Russia. The future of Syria depends on whether accountability reaches international courts, like how we're doing in Canada and the Netherlands, with torture cases, and bringing more and more legal cases to international courts and bringing attention to the war crimes, the continuous war crimes. This is crazy to say, and sometimes I get called different things for saying this specific statement, but we have more evidence against the Assad regime than people did back in the day in World War II against Hitler. We have documents, we have Caesar photos, we have testimonies that work with us. The gravedigger. I don't know if you've heard of the gravedigger. The gravedigger is a guy that was hired by the Assad regime to dig mass graves, to bury thousands of human bodies that were tortured in prison in big mass graves. And if you go on the Google Maps, you can go and you can look up Nejha Cemetery and you can see the mass graves. We wrote a New York Articles time about this. But yeah, I think that we know what happened in Syria. We just need to find the means and have the humanity as the West, and as we claim that we're democratic and we care for human rights and we intervene when is the time to intervene, when red lines are crossed. And Obama did not do that, but I think it's time to recognize this and to put a final stop to it. And it's obvious that the people, once again, after 12, 13 years, are inside regime-held areas, are continuing to ask for freedom, to ask for dignity, and to ask for the removal of this regime. And we just need to listen to their cries once again.
So I'm also wondering here then about, because you've mentioned accountability and its importance, but what does that actually look like in the Syrian context?
Accountability, it's going to be very difficult for us to get every single criminal in Syria and hold them accountable, because that's going to be thousands and thousands of people. But I think just removing this regime and as a whole, system, tearing that apart, and holding it accountable for what it has done, for killing over, the UN stopped counting at 400,000 people. In 2014, that was literally almost 9 years ago, the UN stopped counting. So imagine the number that we're at right now. And then the various different, foreign intervention that took place in our country, and the various different groups that were, if they weren't created by the regime, the regime created the perfect storm forecast for these people to come in from all around the world and commit their crimes in our country and kill people, and use their narratives and their extremist narratives and their extremist values. And then you have various, it's not just the Islamic extremists, it's various different groups that we have right now on the ground in Syria. It's very depressing and sad, but I see Syria now as a pie of cake, and everyone has their own slice, and has their own land. And what we need to do is have the best interests of the people at heart, and hold these people accountable for their war crimes, whoever it is, and figure out a way forward. Because how much longer can these people, as I said before, as the West, and as countries that claim that they're democratic and claim that they care for human rights, it is a duty on countries like the UK, on countries like the US, like Germany, like France, who there are various different legal cases in those countries that were carrying against the regime, which they're kind of stupid. They did their war crimes and then they immigrated to Europe. So it's like, what are you doing? Like, you're gonna be caught and you're gonna be, in court and put in prison for the rest of your life. But this is the duty on these countries and these nations and these envoys in all these European countries to carry that weight on their shoulders and to go and to advocate for the Syrian people, for the Syrian cause, that they're way too familiar with. And if they claim that they're not, that's simply not true, because you saw, and these people saw what happened in Syria, and put an end to it.
So before I want to sort of begin to draw to a close, but I sort of wonder, as sort of a final thing, obviously you're very much, online about all this stuff. You've done TikTok videos, you've done YouTube, you've done other interviews. How have people reacted to you? What have people said to you who are obviously not Syrian and who are watching all this content? How have you coped with all the attention you would have gotten from that?
It's mixed. There's a lot of really good attention. There's a lot of people that didn't know about Syria that now know about Syria because of, the kind of things that I do, that's the main goal. And that's the main thing that I think this is a fault on us as Syrians. We think that everyone as civilians, I'm not talking about government or people in charge, but as human beings, like just as regular everyday civilians, we thought that everyone knew what happened in Syria. That's not true. And with things like what I do or what my organization does through, letters of hope or different campaigns in universities and educational panels about what happens in Syria, it's very important that we continue this work and people learn about what happens in Syria. And I think that it's really cool that we can do this through, just our phone now, and get the voice out and get the message out in very clear, short videos or whatever it is. So yeah, I get really good feedback, and then I get really bad feedback from various different sides as well. But I don't care about that, and I don't even look at it. It's when you do get the negative feedback, that means you're doing the right thing. And I appreciate all the comments, the nice ones, because it's not easy what I do, especially as a woman, because it's not a field that's very much female based. So I do, it's not easy, and seeing these things, and it's my people. So obviously it's hurtful to see and to be there and to witness these things. But at the same time, it's my passion, and it makes me the happiest to be able to educate one person, even if it's one person, about what happened in Syria and what happened in my country.
Celine Kasem, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you guys so much.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. You can find this episode and previous episodes on our website. Thank you for joining us, and please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.